I just wanted to share with you an article that I happened to find as I was reading the Sunday Star Tribune. And this is the 10 things that college admissions won't tell you. This is from the Wall Street Journal. So, take this little tidbit, with a grain of salt. It's only one source. But the Wall Street Journal, one of the things that piqued my interest was number one, not all grades are created equal. And it goes on to say one reason colleges are getting choosier is because of grade inflation. The research shows that the average GPA for high school students rose from 2.64 in 1996 to a 2.9 in 2006, even as the SAT scores remained flat. The researchers saw this as evidence that some teachers were using grades to reward good efforts rather than achievements. So, the full article, because there are other things really interesting on college admissions that you might want to look at. So I'll make a copy for everybody on Monday, because it also talks about the ACT and the ACT score and the SAT. And maybe they're really not looking at considering them as a whole anymore. So I will get a copy of that to you. But at this time, I would love to introduce to you our speaker. Our speaker is Jeff Erickson. He has authored a number of articles in principal leadership, ed leadership. And the articles have been entitled, How Grading Has Reformed My School. And he's also been featured in Family Circle, as well as Educational Leadership, Canadian Public Radio, and several books by Doug Reeves. And Doug Reeves is one of the people that we've been researching these last 2 years, Ken O'Connor and Doug Reeves. So he is noted by Doug Reeves in several books. Jeff has also talked to various schools throughout the United States and internationally. So this, this is a big piece of what he knows. So please welcome Jeff Erickson.
Thank you. It's great to be here this afternoon. Just to that point about the college piece, we've talked with admissions counselors, and part of the issue with colleges, they look at class rank, for example. And admissions counselors were sitting in a room, and they started going through, I've got number one from this school. And somebody next door was looking through the admissions work and said, I also have number one from this school. They go a little bit further in the process and then realize, well, we have number one as well. Turns out everybody in the school that was in the top 25% of the class was number one. And that was their approach. Well, they had a very different graduation ceremony. But it's really an interesting topic. My background, as I mentioned, I taught Spanish for 14 years. And grading for me came as an opportunity as I was working on my administrative internship. I'm currently principal of Minnetonka High School, and we had done work for a number of years, and the grading committee was known as a committee that would not die. So, in spite of many attempts to end that process. And so, as part of my admin experience, he said, why don't you tackle grading? The director of teaching and learning said to me, I think with the belief that no further damage can be done to the topic by me, and that perhaps something good could come out of it. And to be honest, going into that process, I knew some of my work with assessment in the classroom, but I really had never thought through all the different elements that form the grade. And it became an interesting piece personally for me as I worked through it. And it is something that changed our practices within the building. And the piece that I enjoy most about it, and that I hope during our time together, I was told I had until 5 o'clock tonight. Is that right? Was that an error? All right. Let me make some modifications. The afternoon. Well, we can continue there. There we go. Let's go. I can give you the 30-second version. We can leave right now. Anyway, to me, it's been an incredible journey that started back in our school district in 2006, and to this day, we continue to work around the issues of grading and reporting. It is not something you solve immediately. It is a practice that you get better at what you're doing, and you look at really what the end goal is. But I was amazed. I have 3 children. And when my oldest was in first grade, she came home the first week and said to me, I've got this homework assignment that's due on Friday, and I didn't have it done, and if I don't get it in by next Tuesday, it's going to be a 0. This is a first grader. I'm thinking, okay, I didn't whip out my presentation and walk her through the impact of the 0, but I was amazed at how quickly she was learning the game of school. And it's about the points versus really what the focus is. All this work is about learning. And further, she came back a few days later on a Saturday morning with her own grade book, and she said to me about our middle child, Evelyn, how many happy points do you think she should have this morning? I said, what do you mean by happy points? And her point was that in her music class, they were given happy points if they're behaving well. And her determination that morning was Evelyn should probably have about a 7, because she wasn't really very happy out of 10, and that she was going to work with her on that. But you look at the fact of how it really influences what we do. The whole message is, how do we get better at it? And really the 30-second version of what we're trying to shoot for with grading practices and grading reform is being more accurate. And I think there's a real strong connection between college readiness and grading. Because if students leave classrooms thinking, wow, I've got a B+ average in my courses, I do really well, and I'm set to go to X university, yet that B+ average was based on factors that were non-academic, effort and otherwise, well, all good things, and usually can lead to academic success, they're really not prepared. And at some point that bubble's going to burst. So I want to take you through this afternoon to some key pieces. There will be a chance to interact with your colleagues, and also certainly to ask me questions as we go through, as we work through this process. This is an interesting article. This was not from The Onion. This is from the Star Tribune about 2 years ago. Just an interesting way of how places deal with the issue. $20 for 20 test points. I think that's a pretty good deal. But if you think for a moment, what's not that far-fetched from a lot of schools, and I was familiar with the school that had a food drive. And the year that extra credit was involved in a food drive, they had 10,000 cans. The next year that incentive was eliminated, rather, they were down to 1,500 cans. And so you look at that cash for food, I mean, that's a different type of exchange, but it is simply about points and more of a currency system. And obviously when you give a test to your students, what's one of the first questions they're going to ask you? How many points? Does it count? How many points? How many questions?
Is there a retest?
Is there a retest? So they're very well acclimated to the point system. And they've known that. Parents know that as well. One of the first things when we made the change was the group that I spent a lot of time with were parents, particularly of seniors. Because they were obviously looking as their grades were going out, and parents know the current system very well. As teachers, we know the current system very well. We employ most likely the same system that was what we had when we were students. So, currency is what they know. They plan ahead, they look for extra credit opportunities, they really manage that point system. We have computer systems that really convert grades into the stock market for parents. You know, Jimmy's up in math today by 2.5%, he can go out with his friends. Susie's down in English, she has to stay home tonight. Versus if you look at the reality of grading, now this is never going to happen with technology, but if you really look at the research around grading, it is the idea of the red grade book and a pencil. And communication, I think, is obviously central to the process, but the piece about the pencil and the grade book is the fact that learning is fluid and the grades are fluid. And when you look at the evidence, what is the grade that really matters and it's really at the end, what do they know? Not perhaps one test that's not a true reflection. So I want to take you through some of the research around it. That was just a picture, it was a story about my daughter and her experience. The journey I want to share with you is just some what, some so what, and now what. This is particularly what I've looked at within schools. And again, the goal of this work is not perfection. Sometimes I think we don't have everything perfect before we do anything. It's really about simply being more accurate in what we do. And hopefully throughout our conversation, as you've done some work I know with grading, is simply the why. Why are we doing it this way? And is it getting the results that we want? I think this is just as a recent quote I found about our business in school. Just have you take a moment to look at that. Can you see it okay? With the light? The word I enjoy most is the word delight. They have that piece, obviously challenging and persistent. And how does that happen? And that's part of when I talk about that red grade book versus a computerized version of a grade book. A lot of times when that grade goes in that grade book, it's computerized, they see it there, they get back to that fixed mindset that that's where they're at. Versus that learning is obviously a process. And help them work through that. That having errors and having lots of mistakes is part of the learning process. And that's okay. So, what I look at in terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of being accurate, is simply, is this a real reflection of that particular cat? Are the grades a real reflection of what a student knows and is able to do? And that is the test. Does that really happen? When kids look at the grades, they feel that level. When they go off to college, do they see that? When you look at your results and external assessments, whether it be AP or otherwise, do the grades align with those scores? Or are they out of sync? So, is it a true reflection of what students know and able to do? The messaging, and the term I like, is complexity. Is that sometimes we take things and make them highly complicated, and then it becomes challenging to do anything with, versus what's really the simple idea of what we're trying to do here, is accuracy and consistency. Because a lot of times parents will say, why are you changing the system? You know, what's the issue with the current system? It worked for me. It's these two pieces. We want to be accurate, and then as I'll share in a minute, I think it's also about equity, that it shouldn't matter what classroom a student walks into within a particular course, for example, in terms of what those outcomes will be. So, accuracy and consistency. And sometimes when there's some pushback from parents or others, I bring up these 2 points. And it's pretty hard, though I think it's pretty hard to argue, well, I'm really not about accuracy. Or I'm not really about consistency. So it's, when I've had parents ask about this, these are 2 goals, and that's what we're working toward. The other question, obviously, is this another initiative? No. When I look at this, it's certainly not. And everything that I look through, and my lens as a principal and teacher, are these 4 questions. To me, this is the initiative. And grading, obviously, in my perspective, falls under number 2. How will they learn it? Well, grading practices. If you're sitting down together and looking at your work, if you all have different practices for grading, how will you ever talk about student work in common and see how things are going? So from my perspective, common assessments and grading falls under the second question. And that's why, for me, I don't see it as a new initiative. It's just, let's make sure we're more accurate so we can actually get to some of these conversations. Reassessment, and I'll touch on that a little bit, is really when I look at the third question. What are we doing for those students who are not getting it? What corrective action is going to happen? What different instructional practices will happen as a result of a student not getting it? Do grades matter? And we look for students, do they matter to them? Families? And obviously we pay a lot of attention. Colleges as well have a difficult time deciphering. But a few pieces of information. They still do use grades to compare for students. 39% of colleges require a minimum GPA. A lot of times they don't even look at recalculating based on rigor. We always encourage students that they're actually going to look at your transcript, but a lot of places don't recalculate. Weighted grades many times are simply removed because it just doesn't tell you anything. But they certainly do matter. Ranking and sorting. One of the biggest things that's happened in the past was simply all the purpose of a grade was to rank and sort students. Whether it be a graduation ceremony where they simply list the students who's number 1 in the class, who's at the bottom of the class, or within a classroom. The other real key piece with grading, as we talk about learning, is the assessment practices. So, if we look at feedback, for example, within that, if you could see, I'm a little technical this year, achievement, for example. On an assessment, if there's a grade and feedback, in terms of future work, there's going to be no real improvement on that assessment. If there's simply a piece of feedback without the grade, the achievement has been much higher. So the key piece is how do you manage it, how do you have that feedback as part of it, and knowing that when the grade is attached to it, a lot of times students check out from that process. And this is simply just a further piece about that. So part of the question is, well, how do you handle that? And really you look at the importance of the whole reason for grading is how do you give better feedback to students. And the most important thing in terms of assessment practices is what feedback do students have with it. It makes an impact. We look at some of the work by John Hattie in Visible Learning. It looks at all the things that influence student achievement. at the very top, and he's surveyed and looked at hundreds and hundreds of meta-analyses. Feedback is at the top. If you look at an effect size, anything over 0.4 is worth doing. For example, watching TV he looked at, that's at the very bottom. It's a negative. Feedback is very much at the top. It's something that everything shows that improves student learning. So how do we get better feedback with that? Is really the key part of grading. Which leads me to what I'll talk a little bit more about, is that once you work through some of the issues of grading, what I found that we were left with, our first year in tackling grading reform, once we had cleaned up some of the processes and some things that were in the grade that shouldn't, we were left with assessments. That's where the real work, from my perspective, comes, is not necessarily all the grading work in terms of parameters or protocols. It's really coming up with high-quality assessments and having those in common, because that's going to give students good feedback. You can have a great grading program, you can have all the clear outcomes related to grading, but if your assessments don't change, it's not going to make a significant change when you do. This is even more, I think, challenging to read in green, but I want to just point out a couple things. This is by a new book that came out about the assessment. A lot of the work that I've been doing this fall with my own staff in the past couple of years is the importance of the student's emotional experience during assessment, and that importance of the first several weeks of a course. Furthermore, that when you look at grades, the first summative assessment in a course many times will be the exact same grade they have at the end of the course in that research. In this whole piece that he talks about, I just want to read one part of the book. It says, without question, the most powerful lesson I learned through decades of classroom teacher, and first and always as a learner, later as a teacher, is that day-to-day classroom assessments can do more to destroy students' confidence than any other schooling intervention. And this is by Rick Stiggins, who's done a significant amount of work in assessment. And you just think about that experience. You think about a student who gets on a losing streak and constantly low grade after low grade. How does that student ever perform? And they constantly feel like they can't do any better. And really talking about the assessment experience. So that's a piece as well I'm going to touch on. Because grading and assessment obviously do go hand in hand, and assessment really becomes the real work. If you open up the conversation of grading, as you've done in your building and in other schools, grading has been one of the most private acts that happen in the school. And pretty much people are left to their own. They do what they want with grading. It's their own set of protocols. But once you start opening the conversation, what I found is you open the door to instruction, assessment, management, relationships, and emotion. All these things happen within that conversation of grading. As a result of saying, let's take a look at those practices. Because some have used grades to control students. We had staff member, you gave a student 3 passes to the bathroom per quarter. And if you use those passes, okay, fine. If you didn't use those passes, and perhaps had a great bladder, you were able to turn those passes in for extra credit at the end of the quarter. And a lot of things that were used to control behavior. Where when you come to this fact, once you take all these factors out that were non-academic, you're left with the assessments that go in there, and you're left with the relationships that you form with students to make that happen. Current reality. So just take a moment with your neighbor, say hello, hopefully, and ask, where's your current reality? Reading part is now done. What's your current reality within your department or building with these areas? Focus on your department. Where are you at in terms of transparency, consistency, fair, valid, supporting learning, and accurate? Just take a moment. Where would you say your current reality is at within your department or reports? further conversation. As I sit down and look through these words that are up on the screen are part of our board policy that moved ahead when this came to pass. That we look through our steps, are grades transparent? The number one group that once we moved ahead in terms of understanding our grading system, which group do you think out of all of our stakeholders figured out the most? Students. They were able to quickly figure out what goes into a grade, what doesn't, because for the first time, really, there was transparency. As an administrator, we could sit down and talk about grades, and we were all on the same page. Probably the most excited group with change toward grading was really new teachers, because when they came into the district, there was a clear set of parameters around grading and reporting, because often new teachers, you have to come up with your own, and I can certainly speak from my own experiences, you learn by trial and error of what things do you do with the grade, what things don't you do, and to really give them clear parameters. But to talk about as a staff and as you work as a group, are the grades transparent, consistent, fair, and walking through those pieces? That's central. So you're making sure your grades are accurate, you're making sure your grades are consistent, and are these elements part of your work? And I would come back to what's missing on the screen here, but quality assessments, all based on that. These are the two questions that we're charged with, that I was charged with, what goes into grade and how we report it out. It comes back to that idea of simplicity. That was it. The board expected to know how we're going to answer those questions. The biggest piece is why. Parents are going to ask why. I've sat through large conferences. There was a particular speaker that would ask this question with 3,000 teachers in the room. He would say, how many of you are A students? Or A students rather in high school. And you look at all the hands that would go up in the air. And students that do really well, I mean, people do really well, they like it, they want to come back and continue that process. And they were really successful in that system. And sometimes I found that that's a difficult piece because you know it really well and you made it work. And sometimes for those that don't, it can become a struggle. But why is it an issue to look at? So 3 things I want to talk about. Part of my time as an administration, I served at Mounds View High School. And the district had an incredible promise with the community, and really about equity. And the last piece when we talk about why we're looking at this was this part here. So which particular teacher student has or class will have no bearing on the student's ability to attain and exceed the outcomes. It's not the educational lottery. So part of the reason of this why is it shouldn't matter what room you walk into in terms of your success. Those practices should be the same. It should be a level playing field in every room. Another interesting piece to take a look at, and I did this with staff at one point as we opened grade books up and said same course, different teacher. Again, why are we looking at this? Well, teacher A had one way of doing it, teacher B, teacher C, all the same course, all the same standards, but wildly different ways of arriving at the grade. Again, it goes back to, is it equitable for students? Is it going to be a level playing field no matter what room they walk into? If you've not done that as a small group, to open your grade books and say, let's compare how we have all these pieces coming together, what's in it, it's a great exercise to take a look at. Again, same course, different teacher, wildly different grades, because they're all calculated in different ways. I was mentioned I'm particularly proud of Family Circle magazine. You might not think of that as an educational leadership magazine. But other than some recipes for some great looking cupcakes, there was an interesting piece about the grading and looking at the ACT. So just take a moment to take a look at this and really reference to what was mentioned at the beginning. And I think about that, and I remember a conversation with a student that was outside the building talking with the superintendent saying, I hear we're changing our grading practices. And her comment was, well, I'm getting B's in all my classes, I do all my homework all the time, I'm always punctual with my work, I'm worried about this change, well, how will it impact my GPA in my future? I think that's that conversation of now, well, where do we want this reality to be? I mean, at the point where we can support and work with that student, or when they leave? And a lot of this is related to the factors, what they call simply hodgepodge grading. All the different reasons for a grade to be what it is. One of the things we looked at, and I think, did you do something recently? You looked at a B minus or C? Did you do surveys that, or I can't remember if you got that information. Have you, just take for a moment.
The group itself.
Oh, okay.
The grading team.
So let's just take for a moment. If you get a B minus, turn to your neighbor, 10 seconds, what would that mean to you? A B minus. If you're the student or a parent, or from your perspective, what would that B minus mean to you? it mean to you as, let's say, your parent, student, or as a teacher? What would a B minus mean to you? Okay, percent? Pardon me? Other piece of B minus might mean?
Least acceptable grade from a parent.
In American Family Auto Insurance. Right. I mean, I've not heard it framed that way. That's a great way to frame it. So we did this. This is all talking about again that why, and the process that we went through. That I went through. This was months of conversation with staff, but also with school board and others. So we surveyed our staff because we wanted them to say, okay, why are we even looking at this? So these were all the reasons that we found for a B minus. Tardies on issues absence. Some said there's a behavioral infraction and there was a tied grade to behavior. Essay was turned in late. Cheated on a test. I can say the center square is great. They talk about there's a proficient knowledge of material, saying a B means you've hit that level, A being exemplary. The bottom row was the entertainment row. The Eddie Haskell effect, the kid was just simply nice. Came in, 50s leave it to Beaver, thanks so much for that test, Mrs. Swanson. I'm going to help you correct it. 19% on the first test, and we'll talk a little bit about what that impact has. The last one, now this is a listing test to see if you're listening to my own introduction of my background in terms of teaching. I had a student bring in my last year teaching as we're looking at this, brought in a cake of Australia, all beautifully decorated with the frostings of the different geographical regions of Australia. Class was very excited, 6th hour on a Friday, a cake. And I had a very difficult conversation for this student because what I mentioned I taught was Spanish. So number one, I had to share with this young man that Australia was not a Spanish-speaking country. And it really obviously feeling like a successful Spanish teacher at that moment. And secondly, that there was no extra credit being offered. Or we had a person indicating that a podium, built a podium for a math class. So all these factors were simply being influenced as part of that grade. And there are a couple ones, other than the entertainment piece, that we really addressed in our work, and probably the work of which I'm most proud is how we tackled academic integrity was one piece, and how we tackled attendance. So, all those reasons. The second part of the survey that we asked was simply, what is the primary purpose for grading? And so staff, we said, okay, what are all the different reasons? Well, 82% said this, to communicate the academic achievement status of students and parents. So if you look at the previous slide, and then you look at the fact that we're all saying 81% are saying at least that we're communicating achievement, we have things that are obviously not in alignment. Our purpose was not aligning with our practices, and we needed to make sure that they were in alignment. So it answers the question of why are we looking at it, or we're looking to make sure those grades are accurate and consistent, and we know why we're doing it. We know what our purpose is. And I argue that we could stop and head out to wherever happy hour you're going to later. If you look at that first bullet, that communicate the academic achievement, because you can sit down today and look through all of your practices, all of your syllabi, your assessments. Is what's being communicated to families, is it about academic achievement? Is there anything that doesn't? And if it doesn't communicate that, should it be part of the grade?
I got a question on that.
Yeah.
Because I teach physical education where participation is a huge part of our grade, and it's not necessarily academic achievement, but it is the participation and cooperation and teamwork. And so you have the behavior piece that they're able to get along with others. It's also about the level of activity that they're doing. And so when you talk about academic, it says up there communicate the achievement. That's one thing, saying that you communicate the academic achievement, a whole different discussion.
A couple things I'd say. One is looking at the standards. I remember we went through that conversation. Sportsmanship, for example, was a standard. And what was simply developed was a rubric of 4, 3, 2, 1, and what does it look like? It was defining it. And choir was another example. Posture was a key piece of choir that they look at. And they defined a 4, 3, 2, 1 of what should that look like. So it was moving away from more of a subjective piece to what are the standards within your course and how are you going to assess it. And two, there was a question, for example, let's say basketball. What if they can't shoot a free throw? Does that mean they're going to get 0 out of 10? And looking more toward growth in that as well. So what I found a lot of it was defining some of those skills that might be considered behavior, but are really part of the standards of a course. Piece where it gets trickier is simply saying you're going to get a 0 if you don't have your clothes, for example. We really work through, you're going to have to make up that time another way. You aren't ready, you're not ready for class, you can't participate. You're going to have to make that up just like you missed an assessment. So rubrics have been a key piece of developing and defining what you expect students to do. Because if you look at that fact, if we had our touchdown defined by all the different ways, like we do a B-, I certainly find that we'd have anarchy in our stands. People expect very clear protocols of how grade is, or how touchdown is defined, how goal is defined in other sports. Same thing in grading. It needs to be clearly defined. And people are starting to wonder, well, what really does make up a grade? And also looking at what the evidence shares. And here are a couple pieces that I just want you to look at, and just turn to your neighbor. These are 4 key pieces of research around grading. Anything surprise you? And just turn to your neighbor for, just we'll take a minute. Anything surprise you in this 4 pieces of evidence? Spelling mistake? Surprise you or alarm you or?
We were talking about grading as not essential for learning, and we agree that, we were trying to figure out, and she was saying a good thing, we weighed this, the stick for the carrot, and what if we took that away? What would happen? Would they still work?
What I was saying is that, like, reading, I think for most of us, it's the carrot and stick mentality. And when you move to a system like this, you have to figure out new carrots and sticks. They can no longer be the points. They can no longer be the grade. So it's, like you were saying, it opens up the door to conversations about instruction and what are your practices? What kind of environment do you have in your classroom? How can you motivate students without that, the grade piece? So it's like changing the way you're thinking about your instruction and education.
Absolutely. And you have to change. I think part of it is finding students finding success. And I think the biggest piece is how do you get kids on a winning streak within your class? And a lot of the evidence that's out there is simply these short-term wins. There's a book I'll reference a little bit, but I'll just say a minute about now, Making It Stick, that talks about learning and how it really happens. And it talks about and debunks the idea that rereading and highlighting are great strategies for learning. And the fact when they talk about rereading is that kids look at it again and they see the words over and over again, and that brings familiarity, but it's a false sense of familiarity with the topic and they really don't understand it. Or highlighting, they'll go back and look at the sections they highlighted, they're just reading it again and not really understanding it. That the most influential piece, and back to that effect size, which was about 0.89, is short quizzes. Short, low-stake quizzes, where the topics are cycled through again and again, has the most influence on learning. In testing, it's a lot of bad press at times. Obviously, you look at all the state pieces that people get excited about. But practice tests, And those pieces have some of the biggest influence on kids. Because part of it shows kids, when you have those practice quizzes and these short quizzes, it shows them what is valued in terms of the content in that course and what they should really know. And it's not a mystery. And so I think those are key pieces. And then the last piece, and I'll touch on a few pieces, that faulty practices obviously can harm students.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit about that third point about the mathematical
Right.
precision and
Absolutely.
that sense of the computer did it, so it's got to be accurate.
Well, and I'll give a couple examples in a minute, but in fact, when you put it in the system, all of a sudden it punches up 82.43%. And then our belief is that that's an accurate picture of what a student knows and is able to do. It's convenient. We believe it's very objective, but in reality, it's just simply putting all the numbers together and hoping for the best in terms of an accurate picture. I'll give you a couple examples, but really when you start getting beyond 6 or 7 intervals to try to differentiate student performance, it's really meaningless. I don't think anybody in this room, or in my mind, I could defend the difference between a 73% and an 80%. Can you really define what a student knows in terms of that learning? When you get to all those different range pieces, it's pretty hard to decide and to differentiate that. So when you put it into a computer, just because it spits it out, and I'll show you a couple examples in a minute. The other piece I want to, in the second bullet, one piece that doesn't go away with grading, and I say is even more important and for practice, is professional judgment. That once you come up with a practice for your building, and whatever you decide to do, your professional judgment doesn't go away. And I would argue it's even more so. That you need to make sure, at the end of the day, and I ask staff at the end of the semester, end of the quarter, you look at your grade book right now, everything aside, back into the mathematical precision, does that grade in your grade book reflect what a student knows and is able to do? And if you're saying it does not, let's say there was one day that there was a 22% in the grade book because the student bombed a test, because cat died, grandma ill, girlfriend broke up with him, whatever the reason might be, heating vent was on too loud in the corner of the room. But all those factors influenced that grade, but everything else was great. I think we have a professional obligation to go back and make sure that that grade isn't influencing the overall grade. But if you simply put them into the computer, it just spits it out. And parents accept it. It's been a common practice. It goes back to that red grade book pencil idea of fluidity with grading. So, all these pieces, but that professional judgment is critical. And it comes back to one piece I encourage you in your conversations. What are the core principles of our building around grading? What are we about? Because we have an unfortunate, probably about a 15-page document that talks about all the procedures, which we have to have. But I come back to what are we about in terms of our practices and what's in the best interest of students. It's a lot easier to remember your core principles, 3 or 4 ideas, versus 17 pages of a procedural document. Also, we look at our current practices, back to the carrot and stick idea. We get the results because we've designed it this way. And I think this is an interesting quote, that we have kids that are motivated by points because from the beginning that's how we've done it. And to change that requires time. And it takes time for students to understand that there's a different way to do our work. It is about accuracy. So a couple of things I'll touch on: behavior, averaging, the zero, homework, and reassessment. And answer the question why. Some of it though, some of the practices that we have, and some of the hardest part about it is letting go of some things. Just because I've always done it that way doesn't mean I need to continue it that way. And if I'm doing it this way, is it getting the results that I want? And some of the hard part, having conversations with some staff saying, well, this is how I kept participation. It was my Spanish class, and every time the kid said hola, even if the answer shouldn't have been hola, I give the kid a point. Because that's how I do participation. And saying, is it getting the results that you want and being okay to let go some of the practices and try some different things. Compliance and punishment, we've not as an effective way. And you look at ways that behavior was connected to grading. Some of the examples I had: attendance, turning homework in on time, arriving to class on time, unexcused absences, all these behavioral pieces that were connected. Or academic integrity. If a student cheats on a test, in our practice the score was a 0. And that was it. There wasn't any conversation. And we started to have that point saying, well, why are we doing it that way? What is the student learning out of that experience? And probably one of the more significant shifts, we said, you know what, the punishment is not going to be a 0. The punishment is going to be, you're going to have to come in and you're going to have to take that test again. Maybe a different version of the test, maybe a different format of the test. Are there still consequences for that student? Absolutely. At high school level, you mentioned the phrase parking permit, a lot of great things can happen. Or you talk about the fact that we really implemented a 3-step process where ethics was a key part of it. They did some ethics study and they reflected. Because a lot of times students believe that that process of copying something from Google, cutting and pasting into a Word document, that magical process makes it their own. And helping them understand what does it mean to do the right thing in terms of citing work. So what we found is we had a lot of behaviors that were connected to grades. As I mentioned, academic integrity was probably one of the most positives. And the difference I found when 0 was a consequence versus a whole other set of consequences not tied to the academics is you got to the real reason why the student did it. You had a much richer conversation. So are there consequences? Absolutely. Were they tied to the grade? Not necessarily. Because I would argue you could get into a fight during a test, smack the kid next to you, be hauled off, be suspended, and then come back and take that test again. But if you made that choice to look over and copy somebody's test, it is a significant issue. But that 0 in a grade book, when grades are used as a control mechanism or compliance or whatever, that 0 impacts that person's GPA every single time it's calculated. And it's a mistake, let's say for example with a 9th grader, from which they can never recover. And I don't think there ought to be anything really academically from which they cannot recover. But it does take a different way of looking at behaviors and consequences. There's a question though.
What do you say to someone that says we are producing educated but unemployable kids?
Well, I think we need to talk about the skills that we need to...
Well, I'm not talking about skills, I'm talking about behavior. If you eliminate the behavior piece from everything, then they might learn the information, but they're not employable because their behavior has never been questioned or modified.
What I think I would say is that we should be about developing young men and women who are responsible, who persevere, have a strong work ethic. All those things are critical. What I'm saying is that we're just not using the grade to do that and to control them. That responsibility, the penalty for not doing the work from my perspective, if really to use the real world, would be you have to do the work. But we create systems where the punishment for not doing the work is going to be a 0 and they never do the work. So I think it is about consequences at times, it is about changing behavior, it's just not using that one grade as the total mechanism for making that happen. And really getting into, okay, we need to change behavior. Ethically, the ethics piece for cheating, conversations have been much richer when the grade hasn't been part of that conversation. What I found with the grade being the part of it, they would fight that tooth and nail because they knew the impact of the 0, and they would never really admit what they did. Even the parents, in some cases, they're going to defend their kid. Once we say, no, we're not talking about the grade. We're going to talk about why you did this and how you're going to learn from this mistake. In my perspective, high school is obviously a series of mistakes, and for students, and we need to help them learn from them. So it's about growth, it's about learning from it. It's just not using the grade as the only mechanism we have to change behavior. Other things, we look at participation as a behavior that was connecting. Litter, simply turning in a beautiful presentation without much content, how does that influence what that grade should be? Called the litter effect. Or changing behaviors. That Susie takes out Billy before class with the ball, but that wasn't part of the class. What's the next step? It's not modifying the grade, it's really working to change the behavior. Choir is another example, the idea of posture that I mentioned. Okay, it's a key part. They need to define what posture is in that class using some type of rubric versus just simply putting out points. Same thing you mentioned about sportsmanship. Okay, there might be a clear standard for sportsmanship, we need to define what that looks like. So it's making sure you look through the lens, are the behaviors connected to your grades? And so that's something I'd ask you to look at. As you look through your practices, are there things that are behavioral that are part of that grade? Some schools do go to the extent where they'll report out those pieces differently. They'll have an academic grade, then they'll have some other type of grades to reflect those non-academic factors that are really critical, that will often lead to academic success, but are not part of that grade. Motivation. If you're the student in this photo, what's the first word that comes to mind? Keep in mind that we're in a public facility. What might be the first word that comes to mind?
Shucks.
Shucks. Those are his parents who have come to school to consult him. I just want to ask you this. Did anybody say in the room, that first word that came to mind, motivator? No. The most critical part of any experience is how do students get on that winning streak? So if you look at the first 2 weeks, you look at the dilemma of mathematical precision, well, let's take a look here. It September 15th, Billy gets 11% on his first geometry test. And then he realizes by the 29th that he can come in for help and that book can be of assistance. And then all of a sudden, he gets 90s. He gets on that winning streak. And that's what it's about, getting students. And why do students continue to play all these video games for hours and hours? They're getting constant feedback. Even though they might die in part of a game, they come back and do it again because they're getting that feedback. And they learn from that. And students build on that success. So, however, he has 11%. So even though he figures things out by the end of the month, end of the quarter, the best thing he can do by grade is 74.2%. Mathematically accurate? Absolutely. But does it really reflect what he knows? I'm not sure. 11 and 15% takes Frank the first month to sort things out, but then he gets back on track. But if you're the guidance counselor for Frank or the teacher counseling for him what to do, what should you encourage him to do? Well, that's the mathematical answer, 59.2. He should probably drop because he can't find success. So it looks at the fact that how do we build, failure is not a way to motivate students. And that's the most difficult part of the process in the practices, because all the research shows the best classrooms have an environment where errors are welcome. Same thing to talk about staff. I mean, in terms of staff climate, the best environment for staff is where errors are welcomed because you learn from those things. Again, we always have this nagging thing of putting things in the grade book. And some of the best instruction that I see related to formative assessment happens in a music classroom. Think of the band teacher. If all of a sudden the student's off a note, that person is not going to go over, tell the student how to do it, and then quickly go back to his grade book and record a 0 out of 1 for that particular scale. You keep on going. And so it is building on that and realizing that many things do not need to go in the grade book. Punishment doesn't work. It simply causes the kid to withdraw. We all can look to the kid. Yes? No. Well, I think the fact you can look to the student who's in your class by late October, or even maybe right now, who's not finding success. If that continues on and on, how is that student going to be behaving in mid-November, mid-December? And they simply check out of that process. So much of students, and I really looked at a lot this year when we looked at level changes and other things in the classroom, so much comes from, do I think I can be successful in this class? And I'm not talking about a false sense of security by easy assessments, but really the confidence that they can do it. And if they feel like they can, if they're being punished through grades, they simply check out of that process. I don't. Yeah, question?
I'm just going to wait. I'll wait for mine.
All right. Kleenex box? No Kleenex boxes for extra credit here? This is, I know, but this is probably the most anti-grading reform groups out there, were Kleenex companies. Because the amount of schools that had extra credit tied to Kleenex boxes. And you think about extra credit. And I'm not sure where you're at in terms of that conversation, but I would mention this. I've sat through IEP meetings, for example. This was an IEP or 504, or it could be even regular classroom for that matter. The message were two things. The whole focus was around all the extra credit this kid could grab in a particular class, versus where I would say, this is certainly grade inflation, extra credit, all those factors. Sometimes there's a question about, let's say, well, what kind of inflation is, you're going to do more work, you're going to practice more, you're going to come in for help, and you're going to maybe retake that test. And, I would argue that's work inflation, and that's fine. We expect students to do more work to do better versus simply giving points. But we look at what kind of messages are centered on extra credit. And it's an easy thing, obviously, I look at just eliminate or really not have much of a factor at all in the grade. That accuracy piece, in terms of mathematical precision. So I want you to think about this scenario. You've got two students here, and they are in the consumer living classroom down the hall, and the teacher says they're going to stop by and bring you some food to try. And one student has an A and one student has an F. Now first, and they want you to try the food. Now first you have to be willing to try student food. But to do that, well, let's say of these two students, would you want the student who was the A student in the class, that particular food, or would you rather the student who has an F? So I want you to take a look at this and turn your neighbor and see, does your answer change? Neither, unless you're looking for workers' comp perhaps. But take a moment, when did that answer change? So obviously this was a trick question. How many is still opting for the A student?
They're clean.
They're clean. And that's important. That is important. But that's the aftermath. For example, Bill, what did Bill do for his family? He made them a meal at home to show them what a great job he was doing. However, in the end, if you look at what I would consider, and obviously those are important skills, I'm not trying to diminish that, but if you look at what I would consider the key summative pieces of what is it they've produced and which should reflect what they know, it's very different. That grade doesn't always align. Point being, you have to look really clearly at what you're putting in the grade book and what reflects what a student knows. And averaging is probably one of the biggest issues. That there are a couple ways to look at it. One is a school district that had eliminated the mathematical part of the grade book. That all the grade book did was record scores, and it would not average them. And the teacher had to put the mark at the end of the term of what they believe reflected what a student knows and is able to do. The other pieces that I've looked at is you need to make sure you look carefully at those grades. At the end, does it simply reflect what a student knows? Averaging many times does not tell you the real picture of what's going on, particularly if they're grades that are outliers. I want you to talk about the zero for a moment. In your world or in your school, where do you see the zero being used, and is it effective? Just take 30 seconds here. Where do you see the zero being used, and is it effective? We use it again for academic integrity. If the student skips on a test day, it was a zero, and a couple other reasons. But we still had the behavior. We still had kids that cheated on a test. And so it really wasn't the deterrent that we thought. And did we get the results that we wanted? Because the zero, if you look at the percentage scale system, what's the issue with the zero? Right, it's weighted 6 times the issue of other grades. So, my piece, when we made the change, our biggest dilemma was technology. We couldn't get the system we wanted to do what we wanted with the 4-3-2-1 scale. Which from my perspective is the cleanest way. We had to go with the percentage scale system, but we made the floor the 50. Because part of the issue was simply the interval of 60. I mean, they had that 6 times weight. Because we would never have, if we had the 4-3-2-1 scale, we wouldn't have a -6 to make that math work. So our goal was, how do you align these two pieces? And how do you deal with the fact of that zero? Because it's awfully difficult to recover from 1, 2, and if you're getting beyond that, zeros in terms of performance, to get about getting back on track. So the 4-3-2-1, the intervals are all 1, as I mentioned. So our solution to resolve that issue in the right-hand corner of 0 to 59, that range, was to make the floor of the percentage scale for us was 50. And it made the math work, it made all the intervals the same. The cleanest way is this, but we were trying to bring these two systems and we still into alignment. And technology since 2006, when this first moved ahead, has advanced quite a bit. And a lot of schools use the 4-3-2-1. The zero is still there, it doesn't have the influence that it does within the percentage scale system. A couple things I'll just say about the 50 as we work through it. Some said, was it rewarding students? You know, if you get a 30% and the actual floor is 50. My argument always was no, we're just simply making that math work. A 50 is still an F. And how much of an F do you want for that student? What's enough? And so it still is. And it, more than anything, made the math work. Over time, and I know you've had conversations about reassessment, this conversation really faded. We don't even talk about that because the whole conversation is, if kids are getting low scores, you know, what are we doing? What's the result of that? We're not really looking at that piece. It's just simply mathematically. Homework. Take a moment. The biggest struggle, and we recently did a video message around homework and practice grade, is how do you help students understand the fact that the grade that has the least amount of influence on the grade has the most impact on their learning. And try to bring some of those pieces in alignment, for example, of a concert. If you're somebody's in band, you can't just show up on the concert Saturday night having never been to one practice, and for most people expect to do well. You wouldn't go to a football game and never attend one practice and again expect to play and do well. They understand that concept from out of school, but the hard piece about how does practice become meaningful, and how do they understand that that's what's going to give them feedback about their learning. Because the dilemma with homework, we found, if you're this parent and you call the office and it's simply scored on a completion basis, why are they confused at the grade of an F? Right. Where in reality, if you look on the right-hand side, homework that quizzes or whatever you might have that gives actual feedback, you know, they're probably going to do better in that chapter test because they're getting better. And that's trying to help students understand that piece. And it takes time to change that. I think we kind of hit a threshold point where students understood that formative assessment was really about feedback for them and their learning. That culture takes time to shift, but they know how to use that information. So in our world, anything goes in that grade book has to have some type of score that's actually assessed. What changes over time is just simply giving homework assignments saying problems 1 to 40. I see a lot more homework quizzes, small quizzes that give students feedback as part of that practice world. And that just daily assignments become less and less of an influence, more about what do they know in these short-term quizzes. So we asked about responsibility and how do we handle that issue related to grading. So I'm just going to give you a short little story here about Martha. This is Martha, an English teacher, and this is her sink in the morning. She comes down and sees her 3 children and says, you know what, this sink needs to be done by 5 o'clock. We've got company coming over tonight, and I can't have it looking like this. Martha goes to work. Again, an English teacher, and somebody comes up to her with an essay, and it's late. And Martha's response is, I don't accept late work. This is the real world. You've got to turn things on time. So, student says, all right, takes the essay and goes on her way, and doesn't submit it and doesn't finish to where it needs to be. Martha goes about her day. She comes home at 5 o'clock and sees that the sink looks the exact same way as it did in the morning, as you see on the screen, and her children are very happily watching TV and don't seem to be alarmed at all. So Martha has an opportunity here. She has a couple ways she can approach this issue. Number one, she can use her real-world philosophy that she employs in the classroom. And she can say to her children the following: you didn't do it on time, by 5 o'clock, it's now 5:01, I'm not going to accept it, and you know what, kids, you can never do the dishes again. You're done. And next week they'll move to the lawn, and pretty soon they'll be pretty well set. Versus when we talk about the real world and looking at late work, it is about having the punishment be, you have got to do the work, and I still expect you to do it. I can't not turn in my teacher evals to my superintendent and say, you know what, I didn't get to him this year, and he would not say to me, well, that's okay, forget about it. Next year we'll try again. The punishment is you've got to do the work. And a lot of that is talking about those real world myths that are out there, and that is a real world. Now there might be a slight penalty. They might not get their $5 allowance, they might get $4.50. But it's not something that distorts the grade, and it's not something that takes away any motivation to do the work. And so you have to think about what are the consequences. What students prize most? Freedom and time. And so if they have that time when the consequence is doing the work, that becomes a bigger piece to change. It is about finding the right behavioral changes and looking at things and saying, what is it that we're trying to do? Cheating, attendance in class, different consequences. And thinking about how are we going to handle that issue? What's going to change the behavior so it doesn't happen again? So we come back to this key pillar of the idea that grades reflect and communicate academic achievement based on high quality assessments. That's again what I said in 30 seconds, what are you trying to do is this, making sure that's where your grades are coming from. That things that are non-academic are not included in the grade. Well, we simply looked at a solution, and this is where with grading, I encourage you to think about the fact that I take theory plus practicality, and then actually what can you implement. A lot of places strive for perfection right away, and if that's your goal, you're never going to move anywhere. As you have to say, all right, what can we do? And so when we looked at our practices, we said, you know what? The research would indicate all the grades should come from summative. There shouldn't be any practice as part of the grade. We had a compromise, and this was back in the early days of grading reform, and we said at the high school level, at least 85% of the grade has to come from summative assessments. And no more than 15% can come from anything considered practice. What's evolved over time is that 15% is really all these little practices, these short little quizzes, and other things versus traditional sense of homework. In some classes, because they have the latitude, they might be 100-0, might be an AP course, might be a 12th grade course. The goal is making sure that the predominance of that grade is certainly coming from those summative assessments, and also what I see staff do back to the professional judgment. At the end of the semester, they'll pull out that practice grade, and they'll look to see what's left and make adjustments based on those summative assessments. And it goes back to that professional judgment. The most popular category that I found in grading is actually no count. Because it allows parents and students to see, are they turning work in, are they getting that stuff done, but it's not influencing the grade. Key pieces, having common assessments. It comes back to what I mentioned, really come with high quality assessments, judgment, having procedures for late work. We developed a system that's due date, basically due date deadline, where assignment is due on a particular day for full credit, and we have an extension which is considered the deadline, and there's an incremental drop of the grade between those 2 points of 10%. Is it in perfect alignment with our theory? It's close, and it allows us to have some latitude. What I've found over time, with all these practices that we put in initially, issues that we were worried about, late work for example, the 50 and some of those pieces, never really materialized to be major issues. Students for the most part were trying to get that in, or if something wasn't going well and not being turned in, there was a conversation with that student to plan to figure it out. Professional judgment, that's where it becomes critical in your conversations. If you look at this piece, and then just in my closing parts a little bit about assessment, all your grading does is it gives you a frame. As a staff, what are we going to have as part of our grade? What are going to answer the two questions of what do we put in the grade and how we report it out? What the work is actually in the middle part of those quality assessments. And some of the fear is that all we're doing with grading is then we're going to have tests. Well, the first question from parents, well, we're just going to have 100-point Scantron tests, that's all that's going to comprise the grade. And the answer is no. There are all kinds of performance assessments, like other essays, short answer, other pieces that make up that grade. Not simply tests. And the tests that we are giving aren't tests that if they simply Google the question, they can find that answer for higher level thinking. Turn to your neighbor. This is a question for you. Is this mathematical question here a formative or summative assessment question? Just turn to your neighbor. Is it formative or summative? It'll take you until 4:30 Another 15 seconds and we'll look for an answer.
Depends on where you are.
Right. Depends on how you're using that information. And that's a key piece. Hopefully somebody has the actual answer to that question. But it's both. It can be there. It's all about how you use that information. And a lot of that, as you talk with kids, is about educating. And students understanding what the difference is between formative and summative. Now either this was staged. I was doing an observation a few years ago in the classroom and the teacher said to the class, tell me, what is a formative assessment? And the class was kind of quiet, and eventually the student raised his hand and just said, formative assessment tells me how I'm doing in the process. So again, either this was staged because it wasn't planned observation, or I hopefully that they're actually internalizing that information, how you use that data. Because again, once you clarify and say our work is about academics in terms of that grade, it comes down to looking at your assessment practices. The book that I mentioned, Make It Stick. The elements that I shared, what we found really makes a difference. Short, low stakes, interleaving two skills, and spaced. And really having ongoing types of quizzes that give students real feedback. It helps in retrieval learning, it goes back. It again tells students what they know and what they don't know. Yeah.
Explain what you mean by interleaving two skills.
So different skills, and so for example, you wouldn't just drill them on, being my background, AR verbs, and you would also mix in ER verbs and IR verbs. So you would have more than one skill in that particular assessment. So it's not teaching just this topic, and never connecting. And it's providing that spiral effect in the learning. So things come back. I just want to intrigue you, when I looked at the whole process of learning, that a lot of kids look at this as a strategy. And there's a lot of articles that are written this fall based on that book about the fact that testing always has a bad name, but in reality it can really be helpful. It tells students what they need to know and where do they hang their learning, and that effect size that I mentioned was pretty significant. The challenge, helping kids understand that it isn't about the carrot and the stick. It is about their own learning. It is about getting better. And that takes time to change that process. Reassessment. I just want to touch on a few pieces on reassessment. And part of my thinking that I've seen over the past few years in schools that look at reassessment, this can be an issue that bogs people down in their conversation about when do we offer reassessment, to whom do we offer reassessment, what grade do we give within reassessment. And the piece that I want you to think about before you get into the conversation about reassessment, or as you continue that conversation, is how do you know how the kids are going to do the first time before they even take that test number one? And I asked staff, can you go around the room and really say how every single student in your classroom during that period will do on that summative assessment? And do you know that? And if you do know that information, there are a lot of things that have happened before that point. That you've really employed some formative assessment practices in your classroom. You really have checked for understanding on a regular basis in some formal way so that you know. And so if students aren't going to do well on that summative that first time, why are we doing it? I'm often concerned when somebody says, well, I gave a test and I'm really surprised with the results. Now, there might be some surprise, but if you're totally shocked with what happened, I would question what's been going along all the way. So getting after, before you get in the significant conversation on reassessment, what's happening that first time. And not only for you, but for students. When they leave that room, can they go back to the goals and say, yeah, I really got this figured out? And how do they take ownership for their learning? They first need to know where they're at and where they're going. And that really comes through that formative assessment process. But that ability to predict grades, and for students as well, for them to predict their own grade, is one of the best skills. Because it goes back to just simply quality instruction, where I mentioned in the beginning. When you open the door to grading, you talk about instruction and what happens. And a lot of it is check for understanding, more corrective instruction, not slower and louder. Check for understanding and trying different things. It changes the mindset from teach, test, move on to teach, test, now what? What am I going to do differently? I want to wrap up a few logistical pieces around grading. What reassessment? What we've done with reassessment where it's been problematic is when reassessment is not clearly defined. And for example, what do students have to do between point A and point B? There has to be some type of corrective instruction that happens. The one strategy that really doesn't work for reassessment is hope. They need to really think about what are they going to do differently and what are you going to do differently in terms of your instruction. So having clear corrective instruction is critical. Having clear times when they're going to do those reassessments. And then also realizing a lot of times when we look at reassessment, it didn't need to necessarily be that whole test. It might be one particular section. I've looked at a lot of different policies around reassessment. It's a challenging policy to come up with. I always go back to, not a policy, to the third question of the PLC. What are we going to do for kids that don't get it? And the answer that we've subscribed to, that I've subscribed to, is it just can't be I move on. I have to have some plan. And that looks differently in courses and how you approach that. But it isn't just simply, we're trying to help kids understand the fact that they might not get it just at this moment. What's the constant? Is it learning or the time? I mentioned pieces: opportunity cost, corrective instruction, and work inflation with reassessment. And we've talked about those grading pieces. We already want to make sure you do your questions. I know, I'm rushing. This is my last slide. All of our decisions that you make, no matter what you're coming with, is having the idea of the student in the chair. What's the right thing for that student? Learning is about certifying. You think of the CPR course. At the end of the course, you get a certificate saying you've mastered the skills within that course. It didn't indicate that the first time that you worked in resuscitation it didn't work very well. Or as I came in, there's a student learning how to parallel park. You know, it was going many times back and forth to make it work. At the end of the day, his driver's license says he is able to drive. It didn't say he can do everything except parallel park on Tuesdays. And so it is about certifying learning. And that's the end goal. We want students to feel like, all right, I know what I need to know, and this certifies what I know. And the grade at the end verifies that. It's really reflecting learning. It's more important how you finish the race than how you start. You always, when you look at the evidence of learning at the end of the day, when you look at that final grade, what really shows what they know. And many times it's not how they start. It's how they grow and how do you reflect that. I thought there was an inspirational slide at the end, but that was it. The next part of the presentation, many may have caught on that I did work with Mr. Ermintrout for a couple of years at Minnetonka High School. And so this is time where I'll just bring out your personnel file and talk about some things during that time. We can have the intervention and get things wrapped up before happy hour. Is that part of the presentation? Anyway, but to me what's exciting about grading is the conversation that happens. You're not going to figure everything out in 1 year, 1 day. We haven't figured everything out. But we engage in professional conversation about what's right for students and how can the focus always be on their learning. So I'm over my time and I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm not sure how you want to...
Do you have any questions, immediate questions? Because otherwise what we'll do is this will be wrapped in some of the work that the grading committee does. I'm not sure necessarily structure and time, but we will have dialogue around grading practices and instruction throughout the course of the remainder of the year. So if you have immediate now, otherwise hang on for that group.
Just real quick, do you think that this is going to help with the grade inflation with the colleges?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just 10 seconds. We'd report frequently to the board when we first made this change. In the first semester grades that we had a 7% reduction in A's. But the band of A's and B's were the same as the previous year. And as a board member, Beth said, we simply had a market correction at the high school. And so there's going to be some pieces that are going to be problematic that you need to change. Long term, I constantly look at what our external assessments showing in terms of our grades. Is there alignment? So I believe that we have a true picture. When those grades go out, I'm confident that we're sending out what they know and are able to do, not something else.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.